Hello again, everybody. Archangel here with Sleeping Samurai, back to finish the Orcish axe. We've allowed enough time for the glue in between the two sections to dry up. As you guys can see, we've got the blade attached fully to the core, no issues. We've got it nice and secure, so we're not going to have any question as to whether or not it's going to snap off the core. It's going to be good to go now. So at this point, we've got a couple of fine-tuning cuts that I got to do still. So I'm going to take it to the bandsaw again, and I'm going to clean up the edges here, and we're going to make it completely uniform. All right? Okay, so that went really well. Very successful with that. The bandsaw gave me a very nice, clean, smooth edge for us to work off of here. And now, as you guys can see, there's no unevenness between the different blocks of foam that we put on here, sandwiched together with the structure inside. So, looks really good. I think at this point we're going to go ahead and use a razor to clean up small little things like this. Can't get that with the bandsaw and bring the bandsaw right up to the core, but obviously we're not going to cut through the core. So just use a little razor, clean up those areas, and then I'm going to take the bandsaw, turn it to a 45-degree angle, the shelf, and we're going to put an edge on this blade. So let's get to it. I'll show you guys what I'm doing here. Very simple stuff. Most of what I use, a lot of the tools I use are power tools for the process, and sometimes though we just got to do some regular old hand tools for some fine work. There's one side. And there's the second side. All right. Now time to 45-degree angle it. Should be good to go. Alrighty then, looks good to go. All we have to do at this point is use the different sandpapers as I showed you guys earlier in the video. We're going to start with what is technically, I reversed it yesterday, so what you want to think about with sandpaper is the lower the number, the harder the sandpaper is, the more the sandpaper is going to take away from your surface. So the lower the number of grit means it's bigger pieces of grit instead of smaller pieces of grit and being a lot more. So whenever you talk about a 400 grit sandpaper, it's going to be a very fine, smooth, ending, polishing type sandpaper. For something like 400, 600 grit sandpaper, for a rougher version of sandpaper, you would want to go for the 80 grit, 100 grit, 120 grit maybe, and that's going to be a very rough sandpaper and removing again a lot of the material you're working with. So for now, I'm going to set up and we're going to go ahead and sand this down, dry sanding it. Then we're going to wet sand it, and hopefully after that it will be ready to be painted. If not, we'll use some heat and heat treat it as well. Put you here. Okay, so this is our wet sanding bucket. So whenever I get to wet sanding here in a few moments, I'm going to go ahead and use that. But for now, I'm going to scooch it out of the way, and I'm just going to use a trash can, and I'm going to dry sand into the trash can. Since this is such a high grit, guys, you do not want to go fast with this. You do not want to be rough with your sanding. You want to let the sandpaper do the work for you. For now, I'm just basically knocking down the ridges so that we can have a bit of a smooth transition from edge of blade into body of blade. So just trying to let the sandpaper, I'm not putting a lot of pressure at all on this. It's very, very light pressure. Just moving the sandpaper across the surface is really all I'm doing. Okay, and you got the center ridges here as well. You guys should be able to see the detail here. So this is still flat technically. So we're gonna knock down these ridges as well. Bringing it all together basically at this point. Okay, so that one side is looking good, looking better, right? You can tell this side still needs to be done. You can see that ridge, but you can't really see one on this side, right? There's no ridge here anymore. So that's the goal. So again, this is an 80 grit sandpaper, so that's why I'm going to start off with it. It is the roughest sandpaper that I'm using here, and it's going to take care of the big parts. As I said, the ridges are getting knocked down from this, but I'm pretty much done with the blade section here. Just about wrapped up, and then I'm going to move on to a slightly less coarse sandpaper, less less product will be removed when using the other one. It's a higher grit. So as I said earlier, the more numbers you have in your grit, the finer the sanding process is going to be. Alright, now we're moving on to a slightly less coarse paper. Still dry sanding. Now the overall goal is try to get all of the little fuzzy bits off. Let me see. Mostly see it there. Let me try it on the other camera as well. So, there we go. Like down here, you guys can see the little fuzzy bits that need to be removed. So that's what this next grit of sandpaper is going to attempt to achieve. Going to be a bit more forceful with this sanding now. We've already taken care of the ridges, so we don't need to be real gentle any longer. We're mostly looking to use high friction to remove those little burrs that are all over the place. Working really well. Doing a real good job here. This second medium grade sandpaper here. Now with this medium grade sandpaper, tongue twisted. With this sandpaper, I'm actually going to go around the edges of the part of the weapon that is not the blade side, just to get rid of those little burrs that are there as well that appear from basically just cutting it out with a bandsaw. So just taking care of any unnecessary little feathery burr areas. So. Dan. So we're done with the dry sanding aspects. And I'm going to show you guys, if you can see, how it's a lot less, there's a lot fewer burrs going on. Alright, so overall this weapon has a much smoother surface to it, but it's still got some of the little burrs. So the wet sanding is going to take off the rest of those small little burrs that are there, and it's going to give a very, very smooth surface. It's not going to create more burrs. That's the problem with sanding this type of foam. It's a closed cell foam, so all the cells are sticking to each other, right? All the different parts of foam, they're sticking to each other. So whenever you use a rough sandpaper or use heat in your friction with the sandpaper that's not wet, by dry sanding it, you're removing some of the burrs, but you're creating burrs at the same time because of the friction and the heat that's involved. So what we're going to do with the wet sanding is it's going to remove the burrs without creating more burrs at the same time. That's why wet sanding is really brilliant with this type of foam. Now it's time for the wet sanding. So I got a piece in here. It's very wet. We'll start with that. So you can either wet the surface, like so. This foam is fully waterproof. All liquids are just going to run right off of it unless it's like a paint. So you don't have to worry about the water getting into the foam, absorbing into the foam. It's just not going to happen. So you can either wet the surface or you can wet your paper. I find it's easier to just dip the paper and keep it nice and moist. It's really, really wet right now, so we're using a 400 grit sandpaper, so it's very fine. Our sanding process at this point, and adding the water into the process just helps make it an even more of a fine sanding. Alright, so now I'm just going to wet sand the rest of the weapon. The blade is done. I don't think I'm going to need to heat treat it at all. So we should be good to go. I'm just going to take care of the other parts of the weapon where I dry sanded a little bit. We're going to wet sand those down as well. Just try to get everything smooth. And no little burrs hanging off. Oh yeah, that's feeling great. Alrighty, so we now have a blade on a core which is now ready to be painted. So what we need to do is we need to give this time to dry out. I'm going to put it in front of a fan, and I'm going to give this time for all of the water that it's not going to absorb. Again, it's not going to absorb into the foam, but it is on the surface of the foam. And we don't want the water on the surface of the foam at all. We don't want any moisture at all on the surface whenever we go to spray the plastic and give it the color and the look that it's going for. So I'm going to put this in front of a fan, and I'll be back with you guys here in a little while once it's dried out. Okay, and we're back. Our blade has had enough time to dry out. I've got the liquid sprayable rubber that is going to go over the entire edge of the weapon, including the non-striking edge section. Specifically, it's going over the sealed area. So as you guys can see, you can tell that this was still a separate piece from this one, right? And you can see that seal line all the way around. So how we get rid of that is we actually use a white sprayable rubber, liquid rubber, and I'm going to actually just go over the entire sealed edge zone, and it is going to disguise the fact that at one point these were two different pieces. So I'm going to step outside and take care of this. I've already got my other camera set up. It is actually, that other camera is viewing through the screen of my patio area. So if it looks a little dark, it's just because of that reason, no big deal. But yeah, I've got the other sprayable plastics out there that are ready to go as well in order to give it the look that we're going for. So I'll meet you out there.